At Eastwood Middle School, there was a classroom filled with the worn scent of old textbooks and the echoes of long-ago traditions that seemed impossible to change. In that room, young Marcus Jordan, a gifted black student with a natural flair for the piano, kept his head down as he endured an environment where his talent was constantly diminished by prejudice. Marcus, whose nimble fingers could coax rich, soulful melodies from an old piano, much like the instruments played by his grandfather, a legendary jazz pianist from Houston, felt every day like a battle against a system that had already decided he did not belong. His music was a language of his soul, yet in the eyes of Mrs. Calloway, the strict music teacher, with silver-streaked blonde hair always pulled back in a severe bun and a demeanor as crisp as her pressed dresses and perfectly aligned pearls, Marcus was nothing more than a living reminder of the racial hierarchy that had no place for someone like him. Mrs. Calloway moved through the classroom with the precision of a hawk in flight, her sharp eyes scanning every corner as if hunting for any sign of imperfection. Her voice, clipped and practiced, carried an undercurrent of disdain as she announced that today they would be discussing classical composition and the true artistry behind music. Despite the gentle, almost imperceptible rhythm of Marcus's fingers tapping on the worn wooden desk, he felt every tap echo the weight of her disapproving gaze. Each time her eyes flickered toward him, it was not merely a glance, but a judgment, a silent verdict that his heritage and talent were less than those of his white classmates. In one class, Mrs. Calloway deliberately wrote the names of celebrated composers like Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven on the blackboard. With a calculated pause, she swept her eyes over the room and remarked that not everyone could appreciate such high art. When her gaze briefly rested on Marcus, it was as if she were daring him to challenge the status quo. The subtle, mocking tone in her voice left no doubt that she expected him to falter. A few students snickered and exchanged smug glances while others averted their eyes, each silent laugh a painful confirmation of the social order that had been forced upon him. Then came the moment that marked a turning point in the day. With a voice that dripped with feigned concern and veiled cruelty, Mrs. Calloway addressed him directly. "Marcus, I assume you have never truly understood the genius of Beethoven or Mozart," she said, her tone heavy with condescension. It was not a genuine inquiry, but a loaded remark meant to belittle him. She went on to compare his taste in music to that of someone who could only appreciate shallow, popular tunes, an insinuation that Marcus's connection to the rich history of music was both superficial and unworthy. As a few of the white students exchanged knowing smirks and stifled chuckles, the air in the classroom thickened with an undercurrent of scorn. For Marcus, each word was a reminder that his brilliance was being systematically undermined by a teacher who seemed determined to reduce his passion to nothing more than a subject of ridicule. Despite the sting of her words, Marcus maintained a quiet resolve. He had spent his entire life nurturing a talent that was as deep as it was rare, learning the language of music from a young age. Yet each day, Mrs. Calloway's subtle yet persistent barbs eroded his confidence, forcing him to suppress a rising tide of anger and hurt. The cruelty of her gaze and the calculated timing of her remarks were designed to strip him of his dignity, and though his heart burned with indignation, he refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he focused on the quiet tap of his fingers on the desk, a small but defiant beat that symbolized his inner strength. As the lesson continued, the oppressive atmosphere in the classroom only grew heavier. Mrs. Calloway, with a faint smile that betrayed her satisfaction, announced that the following day Marcus would be expected to perform in front of the entire school. This was not an offer to showcase his talent. It was a cruel setup designed to humiliate him publicly. The announcement sent ripples of apprehension through the room. Marcus's heart pounded as he recognized the trap that had been laid out before him. A trap that would force him to confront not only his own doubts, but also the deep-seated prejudice that had shadowed his every step at Eastwood Middle School. That evening, in the modest living room of his small home, Marcus sat before an old piano that had long been his sanctuary. The dim glow of a 60-watt kitchen lamp spilled soft light across the room, casting long, wavering shadows on the floor that mirrored the turmoil in his heart. His mother, Lisa Jordan, stood quietly in the doorway, her arms folded and her eyes reflecting a mix of sorrow, frustration, and fierce determination. She had listened carefully as Marcus recounted the events of the day, and though her voice was soft, it carried a strength that had been honed over years of watching her son battle an unjust world. "You know what she's trying to do, don't you?" she said, her tone both tender and resolute. Marcus could only nod, his jaw set tight with the pain of knowing that tomorrow every note he played would be scrutinized and used against him. Lisa sat down beside him on the worn couch and continued, "Your grandfather used to say that music isn't just sound, it is history. It is your voice when words are not enough. That teacher wants to take your voice away, to convince you that what you have is not real music, that you are not real enough." Her words, though gentle, sparked something within Marcus, a quiet, unyielding flame of defiance. As he looked down at the ivory keys that had been the medium of his expression for as long as he could remember, he made a silent promise. He would not allow Mrs. Calloway's prejudice to define him. Instead, he would channel the pain and the injustice into a performance so powerful and cathartic that it would force even the most hardened critics to reconsider the true meaning of art and talent. The thought of tomorrow's performance filled him with a potent mix of dread and determination. Mrs. Calloway's challenge was not merely about musical ability, it was a calculated attempt to break his spirit, to reduce his passion to a laughingstock. Yet, as he sat in that dimly lit room, Marcus felt the beginnings of a transformation. His fingers, once trembling with fear, now hovered with the promise of defiant creativity. Every soft note he played in that quiet room was not just a rehearsal, it was a vow to himself and to all who had been made to feel inferior by the cruelty of prejudice. Walking the halls of Eastwood Middle School the next day, Marcus felt the weight of 100 stares and whispered judgments. Every corridor, every classroom corner seemed to remind him of the legacy of discrimination that had followed him since birth. Mrs. Calloway's promise of public humiliation was a stark reminder that the battle he fought was larger than just a single performance. It was a fight against a system designed to suppress and silence him. Yet, even as the oppressive atmosphere threatened to overwhelm him, Marcus clung to the belief that his talent was indomitable. Each step he took was measured and resolute, a quiet protest against the toxic culture that had long relegated him to the margins. In that challenging world where every note could either break or buoy a spirit, Marcus Jordan's journey was one marked by both deep sorrow and the fierce will to overcome. The stage that awaited him was not merely a place to display his musical prowess, it was a battleground where the forces of cruelty and prejudice would face the full force of his determination. His impending performance was not only a testament to his skill, but also a promise of retribution. A chance to show that talent, courage, and the rich legacy of his heritage would always triumph over ignorance and malice. In that moment, as Marcus sat alone with the gentle hum of the piano echoing his innermost thoughts, he was no longer just a young pianist. He had become a symbol of resilience and hope, ready to transform every painful note into a resounding act of defiant artistry that would leave even the harshest critic in awe. Marcus Jordan sat alone at the old piano in his modest living room that evening, the warm glow of a 60-watt lamp casting soft shadows across the worn wooden floor. His fingers, still trembling slightly from the relentless tapping of keys that had become his secret rebellion, moved slowly over the cool, smooth ivory. Every deep, rolling chord he played was a declaration of defiance, a refusal to be reduced to the quiet, invisible boy that Mrs. Calloway and a whole generation of prejudiced souls had tried to make him out to be. That night, the steady thrum of jazz mingled with classical flourishes as he coaxed from the battered instrument a sound that was entirely his own. A sound that said in no uncertain terms that tomorrow he would not merely walk into that classroom as a victim, but march onto a stage prepared for battle. The memory of the day's humiliations still burned in his heart. At Eastwood Middle School, where the heavy weight of discrimination had always seemed to press down on him, Mrs. Calloway had made it clear that in her eyes, Marcus was nothing more than a misfit, a black kid whose talent was hardly worth the respect given to his white classmates. He recalled the way her eyes had glinted with cruel amusement as she sneered at him, the subtle but damning gestures that always singled him out and the condescending tone with which she had announced in front of every student that he would perform the next day. Her words had been carefully crafted to belittle, designed to ensure that his brilliance would be hidden behind a veneer of mockery. Yet tonight, in the quiet of his home, Marcus found solace in the memory of those moments. They had become fuel for the fire burning inside him. In the doorway, his mother, Lisa Jordan, stood silently with her arms crossed. The lines of worry and determination etched on her face told a story of long years spent fighting for her son's dignity. Ever since Marcus had recounted the events of the day, the whispered snickers, the dismissive glances, and the sneering tone with which Mrs. Calloway had ridiculed him, she had been a pillar of quiet strength. Her eyes, though soft with maternal concern, shone with a fierce determination that no one could ever diminish. Finally, breaking the silence, she said in a voice both tender and resolute, "You know what she's trying to do, don't you?" Marcus nodded slowly, his jaw set in a firm line of resolve as he understood that every cruel remark was an attempt to shatter his spirit. "She wants to humiliate you," she continued, her tone unwavering. "She wants to prove you don't belong." And in that moment, as the air around them seemed to vibrate with unspoken promises of retribution, Marcus's heart swelled with a purpose that was as profound as it was painful. Lisa sat down beside him on the time-worn couch, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Your grandfather used to say that music isn't just sound," she reminded him softly. "It's proof of your existence. It's the voice that rises when the world tries to silence you. You've had that voice ever since you first touched these keys, Marcus. Don't let anyone decide how loud you're allowed to play." Her words, imbued with both love and the weight of generations past, lit a spark within him. As his fingers resumed their gentle exploration of the piano, the memory of every slight and every dismissive comment transformed into a powerful rhythm of resistance. The next morning, as Marcus walked the long, echoing hallways of Eastwood Middle School, he could almost feel the eyes of his classmates and teachers like a physical weight. The corridors, usually filled with a casual hum of conversation and laughter, were now heavy with a charged silence. Every step he took was measured and deliberate, a quiet protest against the racist assumptions that had tried to define him from the moment he entered school. In the classroom, the old upright piano waited in a forgotten corner. Its dark wooden frame bore the scars of years of use, scuffs and scratches that spoke of history and hardship. But Marcus knew that true beauty was never found in perfection. Rather, it was the sound the instrument made, the memories it held, and the promise of its voice when played by someone who truly understood its soul. Mrs. Calloway stood at the front of the classroom, arms crossed and eyes fixed in a smug, predatory stare that had become her signature. Her pearl bracelet glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights as she leaned casually against the blackboard, her expression one of barely concealed disdain. "Well, Carter, we're all waiting," she said, her voice smooth and laced with a mocking tone that belied the severity of her intentions. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with a resolute determination to transform every moment of humiliation into a moment of triumph. He walked slowly to the piano bench, every step echoing the silent prayers of every soul who had ever been made to feel inferior. Without glancing at anyone, without even a flicker of hesitation, Marcus allowed his fingers to rest lightly on the cool keys. For a moment, the entire classroom seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if in response to an inner call that had been building for far too long, he closed his eyes and began to play. The first note he struck was deep and rich, resonating through the room like the distant roll of thunder that heralds a coming storm. That single, sustained tone, hanging in the air like the promise of rain, was a bold declaration that he would no longer be silenced by prejudice. It was as if, every time his fingers touched the keys, he was reclaiming a part of himself that had been denied by a world too afraid to see his true worth. The music that poured forth was a seamless fusion of jazz and classical, a bold, defiant blend that defied any attempt to categorize it within narrow boundaries. His left hand settled into a slow, rolling blues progression that felt like the steady heartbeat of a man who had endured too many wounds to be broken. Meanwhile, his right hand danced with delicate precision, sending crystalline notes cascading through the air. The interplay between the two hands created a sonic tapestry that was as mesmerizing as it was profound. each chord a testament to his extraordinary talent and to the legacy of a grandfather who had once played jazz in the smoky clubs of Houston. As Marcus played, the oppressive atmosphere in the classroom began to change. The doubtful glances and hushed whispers that had filled the room at the start of the class were slowly replaced by a deep, rapt attention. Every note he played was a gentle but forceful blow against the long-standing prejudices that had been allowed to fester in that space. The old piano, scarred and neglected though it was, sang a song of resilience, its voice joining with Marcus's in a duet that challenged every sneer and every whispered insult. In that moment, it was as if the very walls of the classroom were bearing witness to a small revolution, a revolution conducted not with violence or anger, but with the timeless, transformative power of music. The performance built steadily, each measure more intense than the last. His fingers moved with a fluidity that betrayed years of dedicated practice and an innate understanding of every note's significance. The deep, soulful chords melded with bright, shimmering arpeggios, creating a sound that was at once both tender and fierce. Marcus was not playing for applause or for the validation of those who had long overlooked him. He was playing for himself, for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, and for the memory of a family legacy that demanded recognition. In the midst of his performance, the classroom began to transform. The harsh fluorescent lights softened as if in respect of the art unfolding before them, and the murmurs of doubt turned into quiet awe. Even those students who had once snickered or exchanged knowing glances now sat transfixed, their eyes wide with the realization that they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. A defiant act of beauty that was both a personal catharsis for Marcus and a public indictment of the narrow-mindedness that had defined their teacher's worldview. The final section of Marcus's piece came with a subtle shift in tempo. As the music softened, it took on the quality of a soulful blues phrase, a lament for every moment of humiliation and a tribute to every small victory earned in the face of relentless adversity. His fingers traced the last few chords with careful deliberation, the harmonies slowly resolving into a silence so profound that it seemed as if the entire room had been suspended in time. For those few long seconds, there was nothing but the echo of his performance, lingering like a promise in the air, a promise that the day's injustices would soon be avenged. Then, breaking the spell of silence, a single, hesitant clap emerged from somewhere in the middle of the room. It was soon joined by another, and another, until the entire classroom erupted into a thunderous ovation that reverberated off the scratched walls and scuffed floors. The sound of clapping hands, once so subdued by the weight of ridicule, now became a resounding affirmation of Marcus's triumph. Faces that had once held sneers now shone with awe, and even a few of those who had quietly supported him from afar now looked on with expressions that spoke of newfound respect. Yet, amid the rising tide of applause and admiration, Mrs. Calloway stood unmoved by the spectacle. Her arms remained crossed, her eyes fixed on the piano, as if the instrument itself had betrayed her carefully constructed narrative. Her face, which had been set in a permanent mask of condescension, now showed signs of something altogether different, a dawning shock, a reluctance to accept the undeniable truth before her. With a slight curl of her lips that could barely be called a smile, she finally broke the silence with a tone that was smooth on the surface, but edged with a dangerous hint of anger. "Not bad," she said, her voice measured and cold, "but let's not forget this is a classical music class. I'm not sure you understand what real technique is." At that moment, the atmosphere in the room shifted again. The applause faltered, and a hush fell over the classroom as every student turned their attention back to the stage. Marcus, still seated at the piano, did not move or flinch. Slowly, he turned his head to face the woman who had spent so long trying to define him by her narrow standards. With unwavering steadiness in his eyes, he met her icy gaze and, in a calm but forceful voice, said, "You just don't want to admit that you were wrong." His words cut through the tension like a clarion call. "You thought I was going to fail, didn't you? Because I'm a black kid." The room fell silent for a heartbeat as his words sank in, charged with raw emotion and the weight of every insult and every dismissive glance he had ever endured. A murmur of disbelief spread among the students. Some exchanged glances that spoke of shock and reluctant understanding, while others shifted in their seats, as if trying to grasp the full impact of what they had just heard. For a long, suspended moment, the classroom was a battleground of conflicting emotions. On one side stood the long-established authority of Mrs. Calloway, a woman whose entire career had been built on the quiet but relentless enforcement of a system steeped in outdated prejudices. On the other side there was Marcus Jordan, a young man whose voice, finally raised in defiance, shattered the fragile veneer of respect that had long been forced upon him. The tension grew so thick it was almost tangible. Mrs. Calloway's eyes flickered with a mix of fury and disbelief as she struggled to process the rebellion that had erupted before her. The very foundations of her authority, painstakingly built on the dismissal and humiliation of students like Marcus, now trembled under the force of his words. His challenge was not just a personal retort, it was a direct confrontation with every biased assumption, every sneer, and every silent judgment that had marked her long tenure. The power dynamic in that room had shifted irreversibly, and even those who had once silently supported her began to question the wisdom of their complicity. In that charged atmosphere, Marcus's performance, his defiant statement, and the raw emotion in his eyes became the spark for something far greater than a mere classroom incident. It was as if every note he had played and every word he had spoken had set in motion a chain of events that would not only redefine his own destiny, but also force the entire school, and perhaps the community at large, to confront the deeply ingrained prejudices that had long been tolerated. The once oppressive classroom, with its faded posters and creaking floors, had transformed into a crucible for change, a space where the old order was being challenged by the uncompromising power of truth and talent. As the minutes stretched on and the echoes of clapping hands slowly faded into a reverent silence, Marcus remained at the piano, his heart still beating steadily in the quiet aftermath of his triumph. His eyes never left Mrs. Calloway's, and in that silent exchange there was an unspoken understanding that everything had changed. His defiance had shattered the carefully constructed facade of superiority that she had worn like a suit of armor for so many years. And now, as the stunned silence of the classroom gave way to hesitant whispers of approval and admiration, the legacy of that day began to take root. It was a moment that would be remembered by every student who had been forced to witness the transformation, a moment when the oppressed found a voice loud enough to challenge even the most entrenched powers. Over the following days, the impact of that fateful class reverberated far beyond the four walls of the music room. Students, once too afraid or too complicit to speak out against injustice, began to engage in quiet discussions about what they had witnessed. Some even started questioning the discriminatory practices that had been the norm for so long, while others found the courage to stand up for those who had been marginalized. In hushed conversations in the hallways and during lunch breaks, Marcus Jordan's performance became a symbol of hope and a rallying cry for change. Meanwhile, the repercussions for Mrs. Calloway were immediate and far-reaching. In staff meetings and among the school's administration, whispers of her biased behavior and blatant favoritism circulated like wildfire. Colleagues who had once admired her for her strict adherence to tradition now found themselves grappling with the realization that her methods were not only outdated, but also cruel. The meticulously maintained walls of prejudice that she had built around herself began to crumble, and even parents started to question the kind of message being sent to their children. At home, Marcus's mother, Lisa, watched her son with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She knew that the path ahead would not be easy, and that the scars of discrimination might never fully fade. Yet, every time she saw Marcus at the piano, pouring his heart into his music, she was reminded of the strength that had always resided in him. "You did it, Marcus," she whispered one evening as they sat together in the quiet glow of their living room. "You showed them that no one can take your voice away." Her words, tender yet resolute, encapsulated the triumph of a day that had redefined not only Marcus's life, but also the spirit of an entire community. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus Jordan's name became synonymous with resilience and courage. Invitations to perform began pouring in, not just from local community centers and retirement homes, but from venues that had long been considered out of reach for someone of his background. Each performance was not merely an act of musical expression, It was a public repudiation of the hate and prejudice that had once defined his school days. In every note, in every carefully measured phrase, Marcus honored the struggles of the past while forging a path toward a future where talent and heart mattered far more than the color of one's skin. Yet, despite the accolades and the growing recognition of his extraordinary talent, Marcus never forgot the bitter sting of that moment in the classroom. Every time he sat at a piano, whether in a grand concert hall or in the familiar confines of his modest home, he carried with him the memory of that defiant stand against Mrs. Calloway. It was a reminder that the journey toward equality was not without its sacrifices, and that every victory was hard won. But it was also a reminder that the spirit of resistance could never be extinguished, no matter how hard others tried to silence it. In the years that followed, as the echoes of his performance continued to resonate in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, Marcus Jordan's story took on a life of its own. His music, infused with the raw power of defiance and the gentle wisdom of generations past, became a beacon for anyone who had ever felt diminished or overlooked. It served as a living testament to the idea that even in the face of overwhelming prejudice, the human spirit could rise. And rise with such force that it left even the most entrenched skeptics in awe. Looking back on that transformative day, Marcus often recalled the terror he had felt at the thought of stepping into a classroom that had always seemed intent on breaking him. He remembered the oppressive stares, the whispered insults, and the calculated cruelty of a teacher who believed that her own biases could define his destiny. And yet, in that moment of profound vulnerability, he had found a strength he never knew he possessed, a strength that transformed his fear into a performance of such power that it changed not only his life, but the very fabric of the community around him. In the end, the story of Marcus Jordan was not just about music. It was a story of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, of a young man who had taken every painful insult and turned it into a triumphant chorus that reverberated far beyond the walls of his school. It was a story that left an indelible mark on everyone who heard it, a story of hope, of courage, and of a legacy that would inspire generations to come. And so, as the final echoes of that extraordinary day faded into memory, one thing remained undeniably clear. The most powerful revenge is not one of bitterness or violence, but one of rising above hatred with the strength of one's true self. Marcus Jordan had done just that. He had transformed every note, every chord, and every word into a testament to the human spirit, a spirit that, once awakened, could never be subdued. His journey served as a timeless reminder that even in the darkest of times, the light of talent, perseverance, and dignity can shine through, leaving the world in awe of the beauty of resilience and the transformative power of art. Mrs. Calloway's fingers trembled as she clutched her lesson plan, her knuckles white with tension. Her voice, icy and clipped, echoed across the room as she declared, "You should remember, Carter, I am the teacher here. If I say you are not good enough, then you are not good enough." Darnell West rose slowly from the bench and met her gaze. Standing tall with squared shoulders, he replied, "You can teach music, but you cannot teach me who I am." A heavy silence fell, then a single, defiant clap sounded from the back of the room. That sound quickly swelled into a thunderous ovation, a powerful repudiation not just of the music, but of her cruelty and racist arrogance. Mrs. Calloway's maintained facade of superiority began to crumble as every student fixed their eyes on Darnell with newfound respect. In the hallway near the lockers, another black student approached him and remarked, "I have never seen anyone stand up like that." Darnell smiled and said, "She is not the first to look down on me, and she will not be the last." Slinging his backpack over his shoulder, he walked away, his stride promising the oppressed would not be silenced.